Sam Ekstrom, give me your reaction to Mike Hughes no longer being a Minnesota Viking.
Yeah, that's rough. When a first-round pick only lasts 3 years, only plays about a third of the games, got off to a very rough start. And it's sad because when you have a pick 6 in your first game, I think there's a lot of excitement about the player, and his talent in college was undeniable, and his speed was undeniable. Like, the physical gifts were there, but his body kind of broke down. The neck thing would seem to be a very serious problem based on the price. 6th round pick for a 7th round pick, that it's basically they're giving him away. And I assume they save a little bit of cash in the process. But when you have another cornerback who's got, serious off the field issues right now, and yet you're still willing to make this deal, that tells me that, either they've got something in the works with the cornerback, maybe that's the case, or Mike Hughes just doesn't really have much of a future.
So the amount of money is not insignificant. It's $1.8 million that they earn in cap space, which when you tack on to what they already had, plus what they're going to get on June 1st from Kyle Rudolph's release, there's going to be some pretty decent space there, even after they sign the rookie class. And I don't know if that necessarily means that they have something ready to go right now, that they needed this extra $1.8 million and said, let's get rid of Mike Hughes. But they saved just a tiny bit more by trading him than they did, or than they would have by cutting him. So trying to get every extra dime out of this and then being able to move up from a 7th to 6th. I mean, the way Eric Eager put this on the show one time was those 6th and 7th rounders are like balancing out the change. So I think that's exactly what they did here. Like, what is Mike Hughes worth? Well, it's worth the difference between the 7th and the 6th. Now, when we look back at his career, though, I guess I wonder, are we calling this like what if he had been healthy? Or even if he had been healthy, he never really showed signs that he could be a true starting corner? Or was it just so much of a failure to launch that we'll never really know? I mean, it's clearly a huge miss and a huge bust first round pick, and not necessarily his fault because of the injuries. I just wonder, like, with some players, with Dante Culpepper, you could say, man, that was a really special career that was cut short from injury. With Teddy Bridgewater, there were signs that he was going to be the long-term franchise quarterback. With Mike Hughes, I'm not sure that he showed signs that it was ever really there, that there was much more than an average corner. And I also think that if he had, they would have hung on to him here and not just said, we know what we have even when he's healthy, and we're just going to move on.
Yeah, I don't think that Mike Hughes ever had a stretch as good as Cameron Dantzler last year, for instance, where he had like 5-6 games where he was outstanding. Mike Hughes never had that. I believe he played 5-6 games before getting hurt in his first year, and a couple of those were fine, but really he was only playing because of injuries. It wasn't because he kind of earned that spot. It was a little bit by default, and then just never gained traction after that. I think it was always sort of the dangling carrot at the end of the stick. I never got the sense that he really got a stranglehold, and I think injuries had a big reason to do with that. Like, I think he might have been a great player with better health, but when your second year is coming off a knee injury, you're not quite up to speed, and then that gets derailed before the most important games, where you can really prove yourself down the stretch and in the playoffs, and then the same thing the following year. It's hard. It's hard in the NFL to stay up to speed when you are constantly on the sideline, and especially, the type of injuries that he suffered were pretty serious. We still don't know really what's going on with his current injury, which seems to be a recurring matter. So he is the 30th overall pick, though. Like, let's keep that in perspective. Not every first round pick is going to succeed. And especially when you're picking at the back end of the first round, number 30 is far from a guarantee. You look at that draft, and there are some other names that I think you would have rather had around that time. Nick Chubb, for instance, was like 5 picks later. Braden Smith, an offensive guard, was 7 picks later. Would have loved to have someone like that. Cortland Sutton was 10 picks later. So I think if you compare it to the other draft picks in that phase of the draft, then you can have a little more regret. But if you whiff on a 30th pick, that's going to happen. This is not a Matt Khalil whiff. It's not even a Laquan Treadwell whiff. Like, it's a little more forgivable. And it's not that he was a bad player. I just think injuries probably kind of derailed him.
Well, you're also leaving out who went 2 picks later.
Well, I know Lamar, not fair to the Vikings who had just signed Kirk Cousins, but yes, you're right, Lamar Jackson.
Is it not fair? Is it not fair? Well, okay, so being the person who at the time argued they should have just taken Lamar Jackson there anyway because Cousins had a short-term contract, I guess I'm not gonna say told you so or anything, but I might. No, I mean this really tells you though about like quarterbacks and drafting quarterbacks that you should just do it when you have the opportunity to do it. But I won't make that into a whole rant. I understand why they didn't, but like, what was it worth for you to get a corner who basically never played? And I remember the debates were more so over an offensive lineman at the time. And when you look at the offensive lineman between Mike Hughes and when Brian O'Neill was picked, they're not as good as Brian O'Neill. Maybe Braden Smith is, but there are not many who are as good as Brian O'Neill. So you wonder if they had gone a different direction there anyway and taken Will Hernandez, which I think was the guy that everyone wanted to take. If they don't take Brian O'Neill, and then you've still got the same problems. Although I think you could have sold 2 offensive linemen in a row, maybe for at any point in recent Vikings history. So that's kind of another conversation. Is this like a good reason to take Kellen Mond, even if Kellen Mond doesn't work out? That uncertainty at the quarterback position long-term means you should use a draft pick on a quarterback, because if you did it then, you would have been in an incredible position down the road. That's part of it. Before we move on and go to our fun conversation with Will Ragetz, is this good with you? Like what they've done here with Mike Hughes? Because I did see some people on Twitter who were saying, well, I can't really make sense of it because why not just let him compete for a depth job and see what happens? It's good with me because I think the ceiling on Mike Hughes isn't that high with his injury history. And I'm not convinced that with all these injuries, you can just snap back to being the prospect you once were when he came into the league. Like, best case scenario is the guy just plays in games and is somewhat serviceable for Kansas City. So I'm good with that. I'm good with seeing Harrison Hand as a depth player and seeing kind of where that can go. And I'm good with them spending this money elsewhere, whether that's bringing in a free agent. Like we brought up Dre Kirkpatrick like 40 times, any former Cincinnati Bengal, but Dre Kirkpatrick, Brian Poole, like these veteran guys who are sort of around, Rashad Breeland, there's a lot of them. Maybe they bring in one of those guys, or maybe it just gives you a little extra space to do the contract extension for Brian O'Neill, or to bring in Ryan Kerrigan or something else like that. So I am good with this. I think this is fine. You've decided you kind of know what you have there, and you're just going to give him a chance to, play somewhere else, maybe where he can fight for a spot. But is there any argument against bailing now on Mike Hughes?
No, it's good with me. I mean, the Vikings have done this before too with other high picks. Like Pat Elflein didn't see the end of his final year. Laquan Treadwell was cut before his final year and then re-signed. But so this is not unprecedented. Like, if they have plans for that money, the plans, I'm sure, are more meaningful than the 5th injury-prone corner. And the Vikings are not doing this haphazardly. They know far more about the situation than we do, especially the medicals. Like, that's key to this. And they probably have a pretty good read on it, and the price reflects that. So I'm willing to give them the benefit of the doubt that it's not like Mike Hughes had an all-pro season before the injury. We don't know if he can be like a long-term successful pro. And best of luck to him in Kansas City. I liked Mike Hughes. I enjoyed the interactions with him that I had, and I felt like, he was a fun player to have around in the locker room. But this happens a lot around the league. Sometimes your first-round picks don't work out. Injuries get in the way. And I feel like the Vikings do have something up their sleeve here. So I'm not going to lose sleep over it. It does sort of continue a rough patch where, 2016 first round pick was a bust. 2017, you didn't have one because he traded it away. And now 2018, a bust. I'm not calling Garrett Bradbury a bust by any means. I think Garrett Bradbury is still like kind of ascending and kind of a medium draft pick at this point. But yeah, that's kind of a black hole there for about 3 years.
Right. And at the same time, even if Bradbury gets much better, you're still talking about a center. And, centers are valuable when you have a great one. But if you don't have a great one, he's just good. It's kind of like a linebacker. If you have Eric Kendricks, it's great. And if it's a little below Eric Kendricks, it's just probably replaceable. So it's a good point. There are things that I trust, Sam. I trust that Vegas knows how to set lines. I trust that NFL scouting departments are good at picking out talent. And I trust that the Minnesota Vikings don't let players go if they're not pretty sure they're not great. Like, I can't think of anybody. Maybe you can correct me here. I can't think of anybody who was sort of unproven or younger that they let go and then just proved them wrong. And I mean anybody, like even camp cuts who sometimes surprise you somewhere else. But at least since I've been covering the team, I think usually when they know that if they're moving on from somebody, they in fact usually have too much loyalty to guys and they hang on for too long. But usually if they're moving on, that means the guy's probably not going to shock you somewhere else and prove you wrong.
Yeah. Moving on from veterans, the record is pretty impeccable. Couple, camp cuts. Kurt Coleman became a very good safety. Mike Remmers became, a starter with Carolina, I believe, before he came back to Minnesota and got overpaid there. But you're right. Very, very high success rate. Rarely does this team get kind of bamboozled. So I think that's wise to trust their judgment on this one.